I'd like to introduce you quickly before we start into our different shapes and levels and layers of conversation, if you allow. Jean-Christophe LALOUX is with us, the Director General of the European Investment Bank. You're the head of lending and advisory operations within the European Union and the European Free Trade Association. So, merci for making the time.
Pleasure.
Merci bien. And we have Ndidi Okonkwo NWUNELI with us. I'm so sorry. I tried to correct it. I hope I made it correct. Ndidi, nice to have you. Thank you so much for making time and
My
for
pleasure.
coming to the Pavilion. You're the president and the CEO of the One campaign at the board of trustees at the Rockefeller Foundation and the Young Global Leaders of the World Economic Forum. But you also received national honor by the Nigerian government, and so much more to talk about. You're not only a founder, but also an author and a mentor, and we are so privileged to have you here. Thanks again. We have John STUDZINSKI with us. John, you're the vice chairman and managing director at PIMCO, an investment firm. You are advising clients across public, private, and philanthropic sectors, including governments, pension funds, corporations, sovereign wealth funds, family offices, and foundations. And on the other hand, you are the founder and chairman of the Genesis Foundation, which is focused on partnerships with arts organizations. John, thank you again for being here. We had the pleasure already yesterday to debate, and now we are back on stage together. Thank you, John. And last but not least, thank you also for being here. We have Laurence Toubiana with us. You're the CEO of the European Climate Foundation, short ECF. And ECF focuses on Europe's industrial transformation, shifting the financial system, the fossil-free energy, clean transport solutions in Europe and the world. You're also a professor at Sciences Po in Paris, and looking a little bit back to COP21. A few years back, Laurence was France's climate change ambassador and special representative for COP21, and a key architect when it comes to the famous Paris Agreement in 2015. Thank you. A round of applause to the guests here, please. Okay, let's start right in, because I think I have set the scene a little bit where the power of philanthropy was coming from, but in these new times and in these geopolitical turmoils that we are living in, and combining the role and the aim of PPPs in times of energy transition, what role do PPP play in accelerating the energy transition? Just from the top of your head, a little round the table, and then we dive into the layer. So I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I think the first element, of course, would come from philanthropy now in this time, is just to remind us that climate change is not disappearing. It disappeared from the political agenda, but unfortunately, it doesn't let us in peace. And I think that's the role of philanthropy, one, to remind us of the global public good problems. This is a very important one, and that energy transition is the best solution ever, because at the same time for access to energy for everybody, but to clean energy as well. And there are really good examples where philanthropy has, in a way, brings the public sector, brings the private capital to really look at clean energy transition as a good business to do, in particular in developing countries, but I will develop that later on.
Thank you. Monsieur LALOUX, coming on the top of your head, what is a priority when it comes to PPPs and in fostering the energy transition?
So the thing I would say is I've been running the frontline team, the banking teams of EIB for 10 years now. And frankly, reflecting on your question, I would say that this role, the role of PPPs, is definitely totally understated and underdeveloped. Over the course of my tenure, my teams have lent about 500 billion euros. It's not a small amount. And of that, I would say that probably less than 0.1% went to this form of partnership. And there are a few examples. What was really interesting about your panel is that I can definitely start feeling traction into this form of partnership, which I think needs to be developed a lot. And the reason why is that we all understand, and especially us, public institutions and public banks, that we need to do more with hopefully as much as we had, but probably less. And so we need to unite forces, and we need to combine our means better. And in particular, the world of philanthropies, with the banking world, the world of financiers, tend to be on their own tracks. Quite successful, each and every one of them.
Same goal or different goals as well?
No, they are generally, I'm absolutely struck. I mean, I went to Copenhagen to meet the Novo Foundation about 6 months ago. I was totally struck by the fact that we share completely the same values in terms of investment. But we've actually never done anything together purposefully on that. Each of us are very successful in what it is that we do, but we actually work on parallel tracks. And so at some point, indeed, the question is, how do we bring these tracks together? Because from the few examples we have seen, when we actually do, we actually manage to do things that we would not be able to do on our own, and definitely not as well. And I have 1 or 2 exampps that I can share.
Beautiful. We are thrilled to have you, and we're going to dive into your examples in the second or third round. Yes. Coming to Ndidi, what is coming to your mind? What is the power of PPPs when it comes to our big topic, the energy transition here in the Pavilion?
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor and privilege to be here. Because I come from a social enterprise and innovation model, this has actually been my reality. You can't do anything around systems change without having philanthropy come in with catalytic and patient capital, the political will to create the enabling environment, and the large-scale engagement of the private sector and the public sector. And through my work in food systems, transformation in West Africa, we've definitely used this model. And more recently, through the work of the Rockefeller Foundation, Raj's vision is really around big bets. And if you want systems change, philanthropic capital brings that patient catalytic capital to the energy transition. And we've been really excited about the engagement with things like GAP, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is rooted in this model, and most recently Mission 300, which I can talk more about. Energy access, energy transitions cannot occur if you don't have political will, you don't have the philanthropic capital that allows for the innovation, the testing, the technology, the data that makes the business case, and then the role of the private sector to really scale it sustainably. And I think that's really the model of the future. So I'm excited to delve into these examples and also talk about what we do with the One campaign to really advocate for these type of long-term partnerships that put the most vulnerable at the center of the design from inception.
Thank you. John, coming to your perspective on PPPs, why is it something that we need to talk about?
It's a very, well, let's just start with Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison started his whole mindset, which is something that Elon Musk has cottoned onto, which is innovation, entrepreneurialism is sort of 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And we're living in an age where the really important philanthropy, and first of all, I don't like to use the word philanthropy, because when I talk to people who are very young, and when I go into classrooms of people who are 15 and 16 and 20, 25, they look at me and they say, philanthropy is a 19th century word. What does it mean? It's not about us. We have nothing to do with that. So I actually don't like the word philanthropy. I have a personal vendetta against a lot of these big foundations. I know it's one of them sitting to my right, because they become so institutionalized that they basically don't allow for entrepreneurial philanthropy or entrepreneurial charity, or what I call creating a generous society. And I think generous societies come from the ability to nurture children at a very young age in volunteerism and service, but also it comes from understanding that public-private partnerships come when you have one individual, not necessarily an institution, who has an idea. It might be the individual at the institution, but it might be someone who's entirely independent of the institution. There are an extraordinary number of large foundations that are very good at partnerships. And I think the most successful ones, if you carefully look at the big foundations, some of them are built so that they have so much bricks and mortar and people internally, they have people who know more and more about less and less until they know all there is to know about nothing. And those institutions are far too fat, and they're lethargic, and they don't move fast enough given the state of the world, particularly when you're talking about energy. Institutions that embrace partnerships, and I pick a good one. Bloomberg Philanthropies is extremely astute. Everything they do, whether it's in the arts, in climate, or in a whole range of things on education, in the urban environment or rural environment, it's all partnership driven. So we can talk more and more about this, but I think you've got to really remember this is all about leadership at a very focused level, and big institutions often lack leadership. No one wants to take a big risk in a big institution.
John, when it comes to calling it or finding new words, because you said you don't like the word philanthropy, how would you call it? What is something, a word that we can learn from you? Because language has a lot to do with perspective, narrative, ideas, inspiration. How do you call it when you talk about it?
I think it's about developing common ground with common sense for the common good, and therefore creating a generous society. Again, I've had so many meetings with young people where the word philanthropy, and everyone thinks philanthropy is about money. Philanthropy is actually not about money. Philanthropy is really good. Philanthropy is about mobilizing talent or ties in terms of partnerships or a whole series of things. It's not, money's in the toolbox. But good philanthropy does not start with money. Good philanthropy starts with activism. And when you actually ask young people, or even going, into some business school classes, if I go to some of the Harvard, Stanford, some places where I teach, if you ask people of philanthropy, their eyes glaze over and they look at you and they say, oh, philanthropy, that's about someone who has a lot of money. Or you ask them about the difference between philanthropy and charity. They have a hard time understanding that. There's a big difference. But what they really is, if I ask them, what are they angry about? Or do they see themselves as an activist? Then you galvanize them. Because the word activism, although it has a negative connotation because it seemed like you're going to be destructive, the word disruptor is another word that's negative. But good, giving for the common good requires a certain amount of anger.
Thank you for your perspective. Ndidi, and of course, come in wherever you agree or disagree. It's a conversation, not an interrogation.
So
here.
I completely agree with John. John, I run the One Campaign. For those who don't know the One Campaign, we're a global advocacy organization which fights for equity and justice. And at One, we believe that where you're born should not determine whether you live. And so we always have young people who are galvanizing across Europe and across the world who use their voice to advocate. So I really believe in the power of time and talent as the foundation of any change in society. And we've seen that repeated through the generations. At One, we also believe that we can use our voice to change policy and to fight for those who are the most vulnerable. And that's where this energy access issue also comes in, because it's fundamental to economic growth. We fight for the investments to ensure economic growth and healthier lives in Africa. And our vision is that Africa is an equal player. And I came on the stage with some dollar bills, $100 bills. We're talking about philanthropy, but it was actually my amazing team at the One Campaign that has launched this campaign, basically saying that every dollar spent on activities that spur economic growth and political stability can avert spending of up to $103 on future conflicts. And the data that we have shows that as a world, we spent about 191 trillion on conflicts in 2023. And if we averted this in our lifetime, then we can reduce the cost. And energy access and energy efficiency reduces conflict. There's a direct correlation, because when people can invest in businesses, can live thriving lives, can have access to energy for their hospitals and their schools, then they are better engaged for more useful activity, and we see a decrease in conflict. So definitely, I'm inviting you to use your voice and join our campaign, because we believe in the power of data and information as the fundamental component of any systems change work.
Thank you.
And you've got one of my heroes on the front page.
Yes, you have my dollar bills all over you.
Ben Franklin, who's
I have more for the rest of you.
disruptors. Fabulous disruptor.
Alphonse, why would you like to come in when we talk again about the design of a successful
I love
PPP? What is a priority from your perspective? Not just how we talk about it and who we engage with and how we get the involvement of everyone in it, but how do we design it from a framework and policy perspective?
First, just to mention that activism is a very positive word, because in front of all these problems we are facing, if we are not acting, what are we doing? We are just waiting what? So that's a value, I think, a shared value.
Good.
And it should be a fair value for the public sector as well as the private sector. We should all be activists. I think the experience I've been through with the European Climate Foundation, we tried different things. I think my first experience was trying to build a fund together with the public agencies for energy transition in Africa, BlackRock, and a number of philanthropy, mainly a European and US one. It was not an easy design because, of course, there was, of course, a temptation of everyone not to take any risk and to let the other one take the risk, and in particular between the public and the private sector. So that was a good experience. Then we went to understand that the role of philanthropy in this partnership is probably to bring a lot of information, data, and analysis that, in particular, to the clean electrification of many systems, you can do it. It's not impossible. And the conception in many of the public sector was, oh, it's too difficult, we cannot put so much renewable in the grid, for example, or decentralized electricity is not a good thing for many reasons. So this element of changing the mindset is, for me, the first element.
But who needs to get changed? Again, who do we need to talk to?
So, for example, we built a big program around what we call Renew 2030, which is 20 countries working with philanthropy to facilitate the legal framework. So that was the first thing. Do we have the legal framework to integrate this renewable energy? And then what is the policy you should stop, in particular the fossil fuel subsidies in the country? And so that's the type of thing, changing the mindset, working on the institutions that I think philanthropy can have the flexibility to advise and propose. Then again, maybe making the private sector understand they have to take the risk as a private capital should. And again, that is not only the public sector to take the private cost and just get the private benefit for the other side. So meaning this balance of interest, I think that's the role of philanthropy as well.
Jean-Christophe, when we talk about flexibility, I would love to talk about the flexibility of the European Investment Bank when it comes to PPPs. And with your engineering background and, of course, the financial expertise, how do we bridge then finance and innovation in a very flexible, future-proof way forward?
I wish I had the specific answer to you, a very specific question. I would write a book about it and probably make quite a bit of money on it. Look, my experience has been that, especially when we talk about climate innovation, climate finance and innovation, so when you talk about things that are inherently risky, that entail a market risk or a technology risk, the way these things are best brought forward is by allocating the risk where it is best borne. So the way to do this, and the most successful outcomes we've had, is to combine public money, especially government money or EU budget money, if you wish, for us. I mean, I oversee the business of the bank that is active in the European Union. It is also slightly different than development finance. But so allocating part of the risk to the EU budgets, then stacking up different layers of risks by actors that are bearing generally a larger volume but a lower level of individual risk when financing. So let me give you an example. We have partnered, and this is one of the very notable examples, we have partnered with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and their Breakthrough Energy initiative. And we have created what is called the Catalyst Initiative around climate finance to help innovative companies coming with decarbonized solutions to bring their product or technology to the market in an environment where they sell at a higher price than the incumbent fossil fuel solution. So, to give you an example, high heat for the manufacturing industry. Generally, this is produced by gas-fired power plants that are there to produce high heat. You can replace this with a solution consisting of renewable energy, renewable electricity that heats up bricks. In this case, I will take the illustration of a company called Rondo, which we have financed recently through this initiative. And these bricks are storing this energy at high temperature and restituting it during the times when the renewable energy is not produced because there is no sun or there is no wind. Now, this is a more expensive solution, and there is what Bill Gates has called the green premium.
What do we learn from that example when it comes to PPPs?
So, why am I taking a bit of time to explain this to you is because we have there managed to combine philanthropic money, government money, and lending money from, in this case, from the European Investment Bank. We have invested equity in this company through a traditional equity fund, but we have combined it with grant money. That grant money is coming from both a philanthropic organization and from the budget of the European Union. And on top of that, we stacked it up with debt. The grant money is there to make sure that they can sell at a cost which is equivalent to the fossil fuel-based solution. And this is where the combination between the three sources and the three approaches is powerful, because none of them individually can actually bring this technology to the market at a cost acceptable for the clients.
What do we do now in times when the public money is melting? Because the funds are scarce, public money is, I see it with the example of USAID, so public money is not easily accessible anymore in these times. So what is now, from that perspective, happening now? Because there's a lack, there's a gap. John, and also come in here. Yeah.
I don't think there is enough happening. Personally, I think we need to combine better and we need to leverage, meaning we need to learn to use these systems where we, instead of giving the public money as grants, we put this into instruments that absorb the losses together with philanthropies that generally come on top of it as a second loss, if you wish.
Yeah.
And that you leverage many times by leaning on public institutions and on private investors in turn. So all of them actually leverage one another, and then ultimately with €1 of public money, you make many, many more euros of investments. That's the way to do it.
And we probably need a change in the system, because when you look at all the multilateral development banks, for example, for climate finance is a main source, like EIB, but many others, and you see that the leverage is still very weak. The percentage of, and sometimes is 20 cents for $1 invested. So that's not, in times of scarce public resources, we cannot continue like this. But that, a reform of the system that has begun, but that's taking more risk on the EIB, on the balance sheet, and for all the institutions to do that. And it's really a change of mindset. It's not doing the thing directly, is really the partnership element. But of course, then it's a balance of risk, and that's what you were explaining.
John, when it comes to filling the gap, especially when it also comes what I mentioned, the lacking public money right now, how do we fill the gap, John and then Ndidi?
Well, that's a very I mean, that's a very general question. I think, you know, I mean, I almost think we all should refuse to answer that question, because it depends on the country, the culture, and the specific business opportunity. Because real public-private partnerships are win-wins or win-wins, win-win-wins or win-win-win-wins, and they have to be constructed in a way. I mean, I can think of a couple of interesting initiatives that are going on right now in Spain, in the Extremadura, and other parts of Poland, where it's very focused, maybe not specifically on energy, but it's about job creation. So I think whenever you look at these partnerships, you've got to really, I think sometimes when you're starting this whole discussion about partnerships and looking for them, people often patronize. They assume government has money, they assume foundations have money, they assume banks have money, and yet they don't realize there's secondary and tertiary objectives like job creation or education or training. So I think if you really want to come into a better understanding, the funds will be there in a government framework if you actually can create a multifaceted purpose or intention. And that's really what I'm saying. Job creation is still a very powerful thing. Now, in a lot of industries, job creation is less and less because things are becoming very efficient. On the other hand, there are other aspects of that in terms of economic impact or economic regeneration. In a lot of cases, you've got across Europe or across parts of the global south, rural regeneration or urban regeneration. In using those two objectives, you know, it's very funny. I've raised a lot of money from big foundations where, and you know this at the Rockefeller Foundation, you might start off saying, this isn't really an energy project. This is a project which is relating to job creation. And if you put this particular project here, it's actually going to have a multifaceted impact on a whole country or a community. And therefore, it's going to benefit other people. And then you can maybe bring in another partner who will see something. You know, no two partners look at the same project through the same lens. And if you really are clever with the project, you can actually address or check many boxes.
Just to build on that, using a practical example,
Yes,
Mission 300 was just recently launched by a consortium of partners, and I think it reinforces both John's points and Jean-Christophe, where we recognize that there's an energy deficit on the African continent. 600 million people don't have access to energy that's affordable and accessible. So the World Bank came together with African Development Bank saying we already have the IDA 21 funds, $100 billion. Can we leverage some of that money? And then Rockefeller came in with the convening power and the instruments, and together they're saying, can we solve energy poverty for 300 million people? Now, they got African governments, at least 30 African governments, to sign compacts to say, this is our part. We'll create the policy environment. We'll commit to supporting the infrastructure. We'll commit to buying components of this energy when it is released. And the private sector also has a role to play. Now, it was just launched. Let's watch and see. But what we believe is that, number one, you need the political will. You need the financiers ready to put forward capital. You need the de-risking instruments. You need to be creative about the offtake. And then you need to subsidize in the short term until the markets can pay. But the return on investment is there. To John's point, it's education, it's healthcare, it's the economies that are going to be revived because they have affordable energy access. And when we measure that impact, we often just look at one lens. We need to look at it holistically. But it brings me to the point that Laurence shared, which is we have to change our mindsets about investing in this sector. And we have to use an ecosystem lens to really quantify the impact. At the One campaign, we've taken on the cost of capital to Africa as a big campaign issue because South Africa is hosting the G20. There continues to be a risk premium placed on investment in Africa, which is unacceptable. It's tied to bias. That's a big part of it, and we want to partner with many of you on this stage to actually address it, because otherwise, these PPPs don't go very far.
No, that's very true. There is
Laurence and John, yes.
an overvaluation of the risk in many. In Africa is really a good example where the sort of the assessment is risky everywhere, which is not true.
Yeah.
And again, interesting example in this discussion with BlackRock versus other investment companies that were going to Africa. They asked for a premium on risks that, of course, the public agency should take, where other investment were doing that without any subsidy to do it. So this is a perception. And look at Brazil, for example, even big emerging countries. They are borrowing now at prices that you say, no, it's impossible to have a profitable investment with these costs. So India, of course, is a very good example. So there is a mismatch between the reality on the ground, the reality of what you could do a reasonable profit in a reasonable country, and the price that are now paid because of this risk premium. And that, I think, a big, of course, it is basically the dollarization of the economy, that's for sure. But still, I think there is a mismatch we have to really, and that's why public sector actors can moderate this appreciation.
John, you wanted to comment on that, right? Or did I?
No, I was
and then
I was leapfrogging after your comment because I think these projects. It's not about debt. It's about taking a long-term equity interest in something where you have to see yourself. You know, I have several foundations myself. I have the Genesis Foundation. I also have the Arise Foundation, which is it's in 90 countries. It's 1.5 million religious sisters. We basically focus on modern slavery and trafficking. But whenever we do anything, we make a 3 to 5 year commitment of people and money. And it's hard because you really see a lot of people, they want your money and they want you to disappear. But unfortunately, real partnerships require sort of you lock arms. It's like a good or bad marriage or something you're trying to figure out. Of course, you never know. And unless you're on the pillow at 2 in the morning, you don't know about the marriage, as I say. But the reality is you need to look at this as a 3, 4, 5 year commitment as an equity stakeholder where both sides are equally responsible. So it's a mindset where you're both responsible for change. And it's not just, well, because a lot of corporations are a bit naughty in that they do things because they have an ESG criteria, or they say, well, they're giving X money to A, B, and C, or they have sustainability products, and they want to be able to say their products. But that actually is not going to affect permanent change. And that's what philanthropy is about, permanent change. Charity is about a Band-Aid, which ultimately comes off when it's not dealt with. And that's the fundamental difference.
I'd like to open the floor to the audience because we have so many experts here in the room. If you have any questions, we have microphones here. I think you are all experts in your field. Do I see any questions from, or you're all smashed and astonished by okay, so give me a hand sign. I'd like to come back to one keyword, the perception and the perception of risk. And I'd like to come back to Jean-Christophe to that because it's changing, right? How do we deal with this perception of risk in a time that is so tense when it comes to geopolitical risks? What would be your wish, and where do you work currently on that your perception of risk is changing towards a rightly designed PPPP?
First of all, to say that I concur with Madame Tubiana. There is, from our perspective at least, a misperception of risk, definitely in certain parts of the world, and I concur indeed, in particular on the sub-Saharan African economy, where no investor will touch anything unless you have a double-digit return expectation. And when you actually look at it, and when we look at our own statistics, we see that things are way less risky and do not require such a risk premium. So how do you deal with it? And very modestly from our own perspective, what we are trying to do is to disclose our experience with taking these risks and build databases that we can share, and we share that also with other public institutions. And we've started a program a few years ago together with the World Bank, IMF and others to actually gather real live default risks on these economies, so that we actually try to disseminate this information and convince the investors community that there is misperception about the risk. Now, this all said, the climate risk in particular is one that concerns us at the moment. And it has to be said that at the moment we haven't found yet the magical bullet onto how to bring in these climate risks factors into our investment decisions. And we're working hard to do this.
How do you work on that? What are thoughts and questions that are keeping you awake at night?
Well, you have to really wonder both about the physical risk, the market risks, how these are going to evolve on the very long term. And the very long term is not one that the financial world is always comfortable with, because the financial world is reminded is very much on the short term. So you've got to figure it out a way to bring it into your risk assessment. But it's also, you've got to, but it's not only to protect your money, it's also about where you put your money to work, in the sense that the cost of carbon and the shadow cost of not acting must be brought into your investment decisions. So how do you factor in the price of CO2 in the future? How do you make sure that you integrate it into your investment decisions so that you don't find stranded assets in the future? These are all things on which we are very actively working. And on which I have to say, at the moment, we have our own internal models going on, and we are seeing indeed an effect in terms of computing the economic profitability of individual investments, and potentially sometimes abandoning certain technologies and favoring others.
That's true that there is still an enormous market failure vis-à-vis climate change.
Yes.
And remember this famous conference of Mark Carney in 2015 of the tragedy of the horizons. It's still the case today, and even more when people are focusing now on something very different. And it has changed, of course, in the last 2 years, unfortunately. So I would say in this very difficult geopolitical context, I think, and I don't know if you agree, I think Europe has to make much more friends. And the friends should be, together we have a good trade and investment partnership, and there is a profound interest for European economies to have really good neighbors, or good, whether they are in Latin America, in Africa, or elsewhere. And we have to redefine our relation because of this very tense geopolitical risk. So that's one. And second, I think because we are energy poor country, Europe as a continent, we have to find these resources as well elsewhere. And I think the clean transition could be a powerful paradigm to work with others now, and that in particular with Africa. So, but mixing the geopolitics with this anyway, this tragedy of the horizon that we still don't factor in, even if they are today. How much GDP points India has suffered because of climate change this year? And it was, even in Europe, we saw, this is happening now, just the amount of the cost of the extreme weather events in 2024 in US is several billion of dollars. So, but the market doesn't want to recognize that for many reasons, mostly in my view, short-term and ideology, where reality is unfortunately there. So I think Europe has to really see the reality differently.
John, yeah, come in here. Where agree, disagree, or do you have an add-on first? John, you.
Well, financial institutions today are starting to. We use, and I've gone through this with my Getty hat on. We use artificial intelligence now on a lot of modeling as it relates to floodplains, wind, earthquakes, and everything. As for example, I mean, the best example I can give you is everyone said, well, why did the Getty manage to avoid any problems with the fires. Well, we knew, because of the modeling, we knew that when you have 4 years of rain and 1 year of drought, and then you could simulate what happened with the trees, and then we knew with all the different simulations of the global wind, what would happen. So you can have, it's not perfect, but you still have tools now with artificial intelligence to simulate different types of characteristics that give you guidance. It doesn't tell you the answer, but it gives you judgment on how to make risk decisions. I mean, we look at a lot of banks now use this simulation to try to make decisions on climate change and mortgages, because we can look carefully at, we have an ability to simulate floodplains over the next 5 years in the world to figure out who's going to be underwater in 5 years. And you'd be surprised who's going to be underwater in 5 years. Most people don't realize it, but.
Thank you, John. And before, Ndidi, I'd like to come to you. I thought I'd have a panel debate without naming artificial intelligence, but it is, of course, the technology of the time.
I'm sorry.
But it's just almost on every panel. And sometimes we talk about artificial intelligence without talking about the same thing. But when it comes to PPPs, maybe you can bring in the perspective, you know, when we talk about PPPs in marriage with AI, where do you see the leverage, you know, coming and looking a little bit ahead in the future? I mean, we don't know what happens in the future, but from your expertise on, how would you combine the success of a PPP connected to AI?
So first, I want to build on Laurence's points, and then I'll come to
back to my question.
Yes. Which is, I really think that the geopolitics and the signs of our times calls for a generation to be great. We just had 20 years in our London office of Mandela coming to the UK right before Glen Eagles on this campaign, Make Poverty History, and he called on a generation to be great. So I start off this week really empowered, optimistic, that we can take matters into our own hands. And from a European lens, since we're sitting in Germany, I think there's an important need for a new partnership between Europe and many other parts of the world. And I think it's time for leaders on this continent to rise up and really say, what place are we going to take in the vacuum of leadership that is emerging? And there are two areas in particular, when we think about philanthropic giving in Europe, we need to see a lot more philanthropic giving in Europe. I know you want to call it many different names, but we need to see Europeans who have made money invest in creating the data, enabling us to close the digital divide to the AI point, to take advantage of opportunities for convening to tackle the serious issues, but also to de-risk investments. So that's my first call, because when we look at philanthropic capital in the world, we don't see enough coming from Europe. Sadly. And I see a vacuum here. So that's the first. The second call to action I really think is around this concept of changing the narrative. And I love the fact that you're starting to tell positive stories. I am convinced that we have to change the narrative about investing in Africa and investing for climate and energy security in Africa, because there are deals that can be done profitably at the right cost of capital. And so that's another call to action. And the more success stories we can tell in Europe starts changing the narrative of Africa from a black hole, a risky environment, to one of mutually beneficial promise for both continents. And I'm excited because there's an Africa-Europe summit holding this year. I expect to see a new narrative around financing and financing the transitions that creates an ROI that all of us can embrace. With AI, my concern is that, unfortunately, AI is still in the hands of those who have access, like dear John, and who can afford it. But we need to actually ensure that the research is democratized and the access is democratized, because insurance is one industry we haven't talked about today, and that's a critical part of the private in the PPP arena. And we see insurance companies retreating at a time when they should actually be taking bold steps. Providing this knowledge, making it available to everybody, SMEs inclusive, so that they can hedge their risk, because there are instruments to hedge your risk. But when you don't have access to the AI technology and the data, and it's still in the hands of a very few, then an insurance is not willing to step in, then we have a loss. And that's where we see inequities growing with climate, as opposed to greater access and justice.
John, and then of course your thoughts. Johnny, where would you like to come in before Miguel just mentioned and just pointed out?
Your point about there has to be more giving, a stronger culture of giving in Europe. I think that stems from the fact that if you look at America, America did not have in the 19th and 20th century social safety nets of education, healthcare, pension. They had to health hospitals, universities. They had to be built by the private sector, giving, channeling money in bricks and mortar. The mindset in Europe, though, has been from, and I've talked to young children at a young age in my business school class in Barcelona or in Paris. Mindset is there's no culture of giving because the government does it all. The government provides, no. Maybe the government did it all. The government is not doing it all. And this is, but that gets to this whole point about teaching, how do you create a generous society starting at the age of 5, 6, or 7 from schools so that children grow up thinking they all can be philanthropists, to your point. It's not just something, I get very cross when people associate philanthropy with wealth. It lets all of you in this room off the hook. You just think, I'm not wealthy enough, I don't have to do anything. You all have time, you all have talent, you all can do a lot. And it's a call to action, really.
Thank you. Jean-Christophe, when you listen to these words, you know, where would you say, oh yeah, that is something that we still need to leverage when it comes to this perception, what it means to be actively engaged in PPPs and also creating, of course, more money for PPPs in Europe?
I was indeed reflecting a bit on what my fellow panelists were saying. And first of all, recognizing indeed the point that philanthropies in Europe are definitely different than in the States because we have had this culture of this tradition of welfare state in Europe. But still, I just realized as well how the world of philanthropy in Europe, albeit less developed than the States, has been living really in parallel and at least in parallel to us public institutions, very much, at least in my perspective and in my 25-year experience. So I'm coming out of here with a low-tech and modest ambition, but nevertheless a very resolved one. Low-tech because not based on artificial intelligence, but based on the fact that we do things because we know each other. You know, our partnership with Catalyst is due to the fact that I personally know Anne Mettler and the Breakthrough Energy crew quite well. And we do things together because we've known each other for quite a number of years and we appreciate one another. So, you know, I'm coming out of here saying, okay, we need to do something to come together a bit more often, understand that we actually share a lot of the same values, we share the same motives to act, maybe sometimes with different means, but it doesn't matter. We can do things together. And in as much this ambition is low tech and in a way fairly simple to realize and modest in as much as it only involves people meeting and sharing perspective for a start.
Laurence, I'd like to come back for very last words. You know, when we talk about partnerships coming together, what Jean-Christophe just mentioned, what would be your lessons learned or what is your wish? How do we come together in a responsible, sustainable way and in fact, in a successful way as well, to create not single projects, single partnerships, you know, but really create an ecosystem that is open for collaboration within the partnerships?
I think I can build on what you say. It's a matter of knowing each other.
But we know each other, right? Or do we...
Not really.
Not really. Okay.
The silos are everywhere. The silos are everywhere. Even you go to a country and the ministries don't talk to each other on the energy, for example, or where the treasuries are not talking to the climate ministry, for example. So there is an element where algorithm will not solve that. Absolutely. I totally think that we have to really insist on human contacts and human trust, because you would not do that through an algorithm.
But this gives hope, right? We talk a lot about artificial intelligence, but human connecting. And
I
this is
don't
still
see a way out of this, really, frankly.
wonderful for this round. Please give this panel a round of applause. What a strong panel.
Thank you.
Thank you to Jean-Christophe, LALOUX, Ndidi, NWUNELI, John Studzinski, Lawrence, Tobiana.